the recording now. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Virginia Dignum, who's a professor of responsible artificial intelligence at Umeå University. I won't go into her full CV, it's quite long, but I'll mention that her latest book is this one, Responsible Artificial Intelligence. And I believe the topic she will address in today's talk is connected to this. And I'll just give the word to Virginia. Or before you start.
Thank you, Ola.
Yeah, yes,
yeah.
Before you start,
Thank you.
let me just suggest to the audience that you unmute and feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I will distribute them towards the end. Or maybe if there's some clarification needed, I'll suggest. But Virginia, please go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. Indeed, if I'm presenting, I will not be able to see the chat at the same time. But if there are any clarifications needed, please feel free to unmute yourself and to just ask during the presentation. I believe we have around 30 minutes, for a bit more maybe, for the presentation, and then time for questions. Is that, Ola?
We have a total of 60 minutes, and you can use
60 minutes. Okay,
30 or 45 or what you feel.
Yeah. Okay, so we have plenty of time. Yes. Good. Thank you for inviting me. And it's my pleasure to be here today to talk about these issues, which are very close to the research that I'm doing. And indeed, a lot of what I will be talking today has been addressed in the book that Ulla just showed. I have been working in artificial intelligence as a computer scientist, as an engineer since the middle of the 80s, so quite a long time ago. And I have seen many different approaches to AI, many different successes and failures of AI. And in my perspective and the work that I have been doing, both in academia, but before that in industry, I'm always been very focusing on the impact on how this type of systems, in working with systems who are so-called intelligent, and we will see in a minute what do we mean exactly by intelligent systems, but what do this type of systems mean when we are working with them, or when these systems are taking decisions for people and about people, and how that impacts not only the ways we work, but also the ways we interact and our lives in general. So even though my background is in computer science and in the mathematics, my interest in AI has very much been led all the time by the impact that AI has on people and on society, and how can we, if we understand better this type of impact, how can we then build better systems, whatever that better might mean. So we need to start about what is artificial intelligence, and maybe better than what is artificial intelligence, what is not artificial intelligence. And if we look at what, not only at the formal definitions, and there are many, many formal definitions or specific definitions of what AI is, but if we look at the current narrative around AI, things tend to fall into three main types of approaches. There are those who see AI as next step in automatization, the next step in digitization, the next step in data analytics and data mining. So a new or extended way to deal with data and the analytics. What can we learn, what can we predict, what can we do with the data that it's available, and how can we use that to develop predictions and go further than predictions, really start taking automated decisions based on that data. So AI is for many, and especially when we talk about the current success in AI, is an extension and step ahead on what has been doing for quite some time on the analysis and the the science behind data and the possibilities that we have to analyze data and increasingly larger amounts of data to provide better predictions, to provide better decisions and decision support for people. Another group sees AI very much in the, let's say, the traditional historic way of looking at AI as the scientific means to understand intelligence, to look at human intelligence by building systems which in one way or another exhibit some of the characteristics that we associate with human intelligence. And by doing that, we hope to become to have a better understanding of what intelligence is and how can we then use that intelligence and harness that intelligence to support people's lives and well-being. And finally, there is the large group, especially represented in the media and in some discussions, that AI is some kind of magic. And this magic is both something which we don't really know how it exists, where it comes from, but it just happens to us and we have to take it as it is. And at the same time is magic because it's able to do anything and everything, solve any problem and deal with any issue that we will have. And we just have to sit and wait for AI to deal with everything, either in a positive or a negative way, depending on who is talking about it. But this idea that AI is magic is increasingly pervading a lot of the discussions and a lot of the discourse, especially in the media, like I say, but also increasingly with policymakers and decision makers. So, but AI, it is not more, not less than the systems, computer-based systems, pieces of software, of programs, which given a set of objectives can make predictions or recommendations using many different types of technology, many different types of methods. The objectives are given to AI in many different ways, to the AI systems in many different ways, but still those objectives and the purpose for which the systems are made are things that we people are the ones which deal with. So AI is much more than the algorithms that we use. Yes, we use algorithms in AI, but we use algorithms in many different other areas of decision making, computational or not. The moment that you bake a cake following a recipe, you are actually following the algorithm for that cake. And you know that the result of the cake is, as for a part, determined by the recipe that you use, but for a large part also by your own qualities as baker of the cake, and for for another part, for the qualities or the characteristics or the options that you make in terms of the ingredients that you use for the cake. The same is in AI. So for a large part is the algorithm, but what we give the algorithm to work with, which type of data, which type of knowledge, what type of information we provide the algorithms with are affecting what the result of the AI system is, but also who is using these systems, who is developing the systems, who is guiding and developing the regulations for this system. All of that has an effect on the system. And finally, machine learning is one of the many techniques that is being used to develop AI systems. Is mostly, at least the techniques that we are using nowadays are mostly data-driven. They are based on the analysis of large quantities of data by so-called neural network-based methods. But this is only one of the many types of technologies that we use in AI. I will not go much further on this, but we just have to understand that there is much more to AI than just machine learning or the algorithms. When we talk about an AI system, we basically nowadays assume a system that in some degree or another exhibits some type of autonomy. And I don't really mean autonomy here in the philosophical sense, but basically a system which can be automated in some way that doesn't really directly needs the direct input of anyone to act and to sense and to decide. So it takes some automatic proactive action. At the same time, these systems are interacting with us in our environment, and sometimes in collaboration with us, sometimes in replacing us. And they, for one way or another, are able to adapt their behavior to the information that they receive from the data or from the sensors that determine the input to the system. So the systems have these three characteristics, and put together, that's what makes this type of systems different from a normal computer system. And and that's what also then these three characteristics together are, let's say, the reasons that makes that all this discussion, current discussion on responsibility, on fairness, on ethics, on impact, on trustworthiness of this type of systems is happening now much more than what we ever had in the whole history of computing so far. But what we cannot forget is that the AI system is not just this piece of software with this type of characteristics. These systems are not alone. They are not existing in a vacuum, but they are part of a social technical system in which the people that develop them, the people that use them, the people that own them, the people that and the organizations that regulate and monitor this type of systems, all of us, all these people, all these organizations have a role and are part of the overall system as we are using and as they are affecting the world nowadays. So when we talk about responsible AI, we are not only addressing the software, but we are addressing this whole social technical system around the software. And why are we talking about responsible AI? One of the main reasons is the fact that AI can potentially do a lot. And the question is, should AI be doing that? And at the same time, we have to realize that we do call these systems intelligent, but in a sense, and if you look at what these systems can do, they are very far from being intelligent in the way that we consider a person intelligent. They are very good at doing some very specific tasks within very specific contexts, but they are very bad still now, 60 years, 70 years after the whole field has started, are very bad at understanding the meaning of what they are doing. So a system that it's very good to and very perfect to identify cats in pictures or dogs in pictures or cancer cells in X-rays still has no idea whatsoever of what it means to be a dog or a cat or a cancer cell, and what are the consequences of being or not a dog or a cat or a cancer cell. So the systems are intelligent in very, and I'm talking about general systems. There are, of course, a lot of work in research which tends to attempts to go further than this, but those systems that we are seeing working in the world, taking decisions in the world, and which are the focus and the concern of all the activities at this moment around the regulation and principles for AI, are systems like I say, which are intelligent in very specific, very narrow types of focus, and which are very hard to understand when you get outside of those contexts. So yes, AI can do a lot, and these systems, even with these limitations, can potentially do a lot, can potentially do a lot of good. and we see already a lot of situations and cases in which we are using AI systems very successfully. The point is, the question here is, and it's a question that it's not for the system to decide, but for us, what should the system be doing? In which situations are we comfortable? Are we happy to see, to have decisions made automatically by a computer system, and which are the situations in which we would like to take some caution. And the question, of course, is then, who are we? Who is this we that are taking these decisions? And how are these people, these organizations, taking those decisions? Which type of values should be considered? Whose values should be considered? Those of the owner, those of the one who, the client, the one of the developer, the one of the country? Which values should we be taking into account? As we know that in most cases we cannot address and satisfy all possible values and all possible principles at the same time, how are we going to prioritize or deal with dilemmas if we cannot have privacy and security at the same time, if we cannot have efficiency and computer or environmental lower power consumption at the same time? Who are going to make these decisions? How can you measure, in a sense, improve in fairness or improve in the quality of the decision or in the quality of the explanation of the system? How are we going to measure that with respect to a potential increase in the computer capabilities and therefore the energy consumption that the system is going to take more because of trying to deal with fairness or trying to deal with privacy or explanation? So how are we going to balance these issues, and who is going to take these decisions? So responsible AI is about ensuring that systems are aligned with legal directives and regulations, which is of course something which needs to be done for any system in any case. But it's also about considering that systems are aligned somehow during their design and during their use and maintenance, are aligned with the principles of ethics, with human rights, with societal principles and values. But at the same time, it's also about ensuring that the AI system, the software, is reliable, is robust, doesn't crash, and does what you expect it to do, which in many cases is unfortunately yet not something which we can guarantee all the time. It's also about building systems that are beneficial, and again, here starts the discussion again, beneficial for who and beneficial how. And we also need to take into account that it's not just say that we want a system to be reliable or ethical or lawful, but we also need to provide the means to verify that that is indeed so. So it's easy or easier to say that we want the system to be fair, but it's extremely complex to verify, and I mean really mathematically verify the code and the models and the theories and the methods behind the system to guarantee that indeed that fairness is present in the design and in the behavior of the system. At the same time, we also, when we talk about responsible AI, it's about recognizing that the AI system is an artifact, is a piece of software designed by people and with purpose that we people set. Even in the cases when systems self-generate themselves or evolve or recreating their own rules, even in those cases, the origin is always from a purpose set to the systems by people. And therefore the responsibility is in us, which set the purpose for the system. So there is a saying that some of the well-known AI researcher, Stuart Russell, always says, is that in order to build systems to do what we want them to do, we really have to be very sure that we put in that the purpose that we put in the system is the purpose that we really want for the system. And there are many cases in which that is not clear or not well specified enough. And in this area, there is at this moment a lot of work being done by many, many different organizations across the world about setting or laying down which are the principles and the guidelines that should be serving and supporting ensuring that AI that it's developed and used is indeed AI that that we can use responsibly and that we can trust and that follows these directives that I just described in the previous slide. There are many of them. I believe that in the last few years, or by the last count, there are around 170 different types of principles by different countries, by different international organizations, by public and private agencies. Everybody and anybody that counts has come up with a set of principles and guidelines for AI. It is good in the sense that the awareness is there, that the realization is there that we really need as society to set down the rules and the expectations for the use and the impact of this type of systems. It is also good because, in a sense, even if they are all very different and built for different purposes, the aim of the principles and the core principles are very much similar in all of these guidelines. Doesn't matter where in the world they come from, if it's a public or private organization, if it comes from China, the United States, or the European Union. Most of them will talk about the issues of transparency, they talk about diversity and non-discrimination, they talk about accountability, they talk about privacy and data governance. So all these type of issues are repeated again and again in one way or another by all these different types of principles. So there is a lot of good and a lot of very positive things happening. What we do really need to move now into the next step is the step of really operationalizing these principles. It's easy or easier to come up with the principles, but it is not sufficient to have a list of principles and then tell the developers or the manufacturers, here is what we want you to ensure that your AI system does. But we really need to move into how can we operationalize, how can we implement this type of principles in the systems that we are developing and designing and using. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. And fortunately, a lot of these organizations are indeed working hard at the moment in these more operationalization steps. Because these principles are, again, principles for us, for people, for organizations, for the agencies, for those who use, develop, or maintain, or in somehow deploy this type of systems. It's not only for the software, it's really for us. So to take responsibility in AI, how can we move into this operationalization? And that is part of what the book that I wrote and Ola just referred to is about, is how can we then take responsibility? And the proposal there is ART. And ART stands for accountability, responsibility, and transparency. And that comes with the idea that once you have systems which are autonomous or can act autonomously, we need to put the responsibility for this autonomy somewhere. We cannot put it solely in the system, but we need to develop the scaffolding to the autonomy of the system in order to have organizations or people or agencies which take the responsibility for what the system is or is not doing. If these systems are interacting with us, then we need to demand some accountability from the system. And this accountability can be done in two ways. In one way is about asking the system to account for what it has been doing and why it has been doing something. So ask explanations from the system. And at the same time, we also need to ask accountability or ask the possibility to take care of potential misuses or mistakes or errors that the system makes. We do need to have these agencies, these bodies that are accountable for the the use of the system, and that therefore are the ones which need to be addressed when things go wrong, let's say. Because this type of software that we are using to build this type of systems is extremely complex, and it's also software that adapts to different situations, that in principle can change the decision as it learns or it gets more information later on. So it's evolving as the type of decisions, and in some cases even as the program themselves also evolve. Then we need to understand what is happening. Why is the software adapting? Is it adapting to what? And what are the choices that are there for this adaptation? So what are the options that the system can take to change one way or another? This transparency doesn't mean only the idea that we have to open up the black box of the system or the programs as they are developed. In some cases, that openness of the black box is not always possible or even desirable, but it's about having transparency or having openness about the criteria that are being used for the adaptability, to have transparency and openness about the types of data that are used by the system and that have been used in the training of the system. It's also to have openness and transparency about the stakeholders involved, about their own stakes in the system, and about the choices and options and the decisions that have been made to design and to develop and to implement and use this system. So there is much more to transparency than just the idea that we need to open up the complex, the black box of the complex piece of program. And we can take responsibility in different ways. We can first look at the processes. What are the processes being used to develop, to research, to use, to maintain, to implement, to regulate this type of systems? Are there principles, ethical and societal principles that we need to require in this development process, in this involvement of stakeholders, in the types of considerations that are taken or not in the process of development and use of the system? At the same time, or alternatively, we can look at the behavior of the systems, the results of the system. This is what we often talk about: ethics by design, or privacy by design, or legal protection by design, and so on. So it's about building systems that by design ensure a specific set of principles or of constraints or characteristics. And finally, we take responsibility for the design. And this is as people, as organizations, as human institutions, taking the responsibility for the systems, the components, the software that we are developing and using and implementing in many different types of systems and conditions. So we look at the process, that the responsibility in the design, the responsibility by design, and we take the responsibility for the design. And to do this, we have to start by thinking about which decisions do we want an AI system to make. Are these decisions about the actions, the plans, or are we also willing or comfortable with AI systems that take decisions concerning our goals, our aims, and our motives, like there in the cartoon about the car? Do we want, or are we willing to build systems that benefit the individual, the user, the direct user of the system? Or are we building systems that should be beneficial for the group, for the society, for the common good in general? And we all know that these two things are not always aligned. So what is good for me is not necessarily what is good for us, and the other way around as well. And then we need to move into the question about how should AI be taking those decisions? How can AI, the system, which is an artifact which we build, what kind of information, what kind of constraints, what kind of steps do we want the system to take? What kind of priorities we want the system to take in the case that not all values can be upheld and ensured at the same time? How do we balance between security and justice and freedom and privacy and so on? And who is taking these decisions? Because we know that just purely building systems that follow the law not necessarily guarantees that the system is also doing morally acceptable or ethically acceptable decision, and also not a decision that is socially accepted. So again, here we have a dilemma between these things, and you just have to think about many of the, and this changes from one to another country, from one to another time, from one to another situation. So how are we dealing with this dilemma? It's again a type of dilemma, and how do we ensure that the systems that we are building are behaving or are acting within a part of this space in which we are comfortable with the decisions that are taken. So another one is that in the same way that we develop another issue is the issue that how AI is taking decisions involves some type of agreement, both agreement in terms of how we decide which systems to build, but it also involves some decisions or some choices or some aggregation when the system is dealing with different data points which point in different directions. How can the system then take a decision in which it aggregates in one way or another the different suggestions that are given to the system by the data that is being made available? And like in any other type of multi-party or multi-user, decision system, the choices that we provide to the system, so the data that we give the system, will influence for a large part what type of decisions the system can take. If we give the system information about gender, the system can take that information in its in the decision that it takes, in the analysis that it makes of the data. If we don't give the system information about the color of the socks of the users, probably the system will not be able to make any decision based in the color of socks, whether that would be important or not. It's a choice that we do give information about gender, or do we give information about where you live or what your preferences are in terms of Netflix films, or your credit rating and so on, but we decide not to give the system information about the color of the socks or other types of things. There are choices there. At the same time, the way we formulate the decisions to the system, the way we describe what are the options and how the choice is going to be made and the decision is going to be made, also influences the decision. As it influences the decision, the involvement of different stakeholders, both in terms of how commit they are to use and to participate in the design, but also how commit they are to the topic or the focus of the scope of the system. The legitimacy is another issue. And finally, the voting or the aggregation methods that we use, from a simple average to complex border voting or whatever other types of aggregation methods, all of that, it will determine, like in an election, the end result of the system. So it's not just about the data that we give it, but all these options are also determine what is at the end the decision that the system is going to take. because the way we design them, it will impact the decisions that the system makes, which then will impact our society, our environment, and that again will impact the design, and we have this cycle going on and on. Another issue to consider, and I think we should be closing up to go to leave some time for discussions. Another issue to understand is that it's easy to talk about highly abstract values. It's easy to talk about we want the system to be fair. We want the system to ensure privacy. We want the system not to discriminate. We want the system to be built in a carbon neutral way. So talking about these values, agreeing on this type of high-level values is the easy part. The complex part is to understand and to decide on how to implement these issues, because all of them can have many different interpretations in many different contexts, and these interpretations change with the context, change with the culture, change with the time, change with the situation and the resources that are being concerned. Here are just some examples about fairness. What is fair? Has many different consequences depending how you are interpreting and implementing then this fairness. So more than deciding on the fairness method that you are taking, it is very important to understand and to make these choices explicit, and moreover to understand how the choice for a specific interpretation of fairness is contextual, and what are the contexts in which this specific interpretation will work. So there is a lot of work also outside of AI on the design for values, or values by design, value sensitive design methodologies, which basically try to combine and to provide a framework to move and to support the specification of values, but also about the interpretation of these values and the implementation or concretization in terms of system functionalities in a ways that we can at the same time evaluate what the system is doing in terms of these high-level values in a measurable way, and in a way that can be implementable in the situation and the context in which we are. And now finally, I would like just to talk a little bit more about these ideas of building systems that are ethical by design. What does that mean? And whether is that endeavor that is expected to be successful and to be something to pursue. We all know that we are ethical in many different ways, that ethics and interpretation and the way that we reason about values has many different types of views, many different perspectives. There are across the times and across the cultures and across disciplines, different ways to decide what is the good, what is the right. So the issue is not so much to know the answer to a specific ethical question, but recognizing that this type of systems that we are building will definitely be involved in taking decisions which might have an ethical consequence or an ethical stance. It's also about recognizing that in ethics there is not one right answer. There is not a silver bullet, but there are many different views to the same problem. And depending on that views, the decision that you take might be different. Just to give a small example, and going back to the ever-present trolley problem when we talk about AI ethics. So AI ethics is not about the trolley problem, and even the trolley problem is a problem that as an engineer we should be addressing from a completely different perspective. The engineering questions here is not whether or not the car should decide to drive over the baby or the old lady, but it's how can we build better brakes for this car? How can we build better crossings for this place that the baby is not crossing the zebra place? How can we build better laws to ensure and to guarantee the safety of both cars, drivers, passengers, babies, old ladies, and whatever else? So there are many other engineering and research questions in this issue than the rather stupid question of whether the car should be driving over the baby or the old lady in this case. And even if we would take that as the idea of what AI ethics is about, like some of many people are looking at, if we take the views of the different leading ethical philosophers across the time, they would come most probably with a different decision on what the car should take. If we look at utilitarianism ethics, it would be about the result of the action. If we talk more about the deontological or Kantian ethics, it's not so much about the result, but about the decisions. And even if you go further into the virtues ethics of Aristotle, is not about the results or decisions, but is much more about the motives behind those decisions and those results. So we would get to many different types of cars, and maybe in some years you can go to the car shop and buy a car which is utilitarian or a car which is Kantian or whatever else, who knows. But like I say, the issues in AI ethics, let me go quick to the issues in AI ethics is not so much about these trolley problems, is about issues of accountability, is issues of understanding that the types of technologies and methods that we are using are most likely leading us to repeat the past, because the data that we have is always about the past. We don't have data about the future. So by focusing decision making on data analytics, we are looking most likely at repeating what has been happening in the past. It's about the issues that where I started this presentation. Which decision should the system be making? And is about issues of well-being versus welfare, is about issues of privacy versus security, is about issues of efficiency or correctness, accuracy of the answers versus computer and energy consumption. Those are the kind of issues that we really need to be looking at when we talk about AI and ethics. And as one last thing before we finish, more on the issue of regulation and issues of ensuring that the AI systems that are available and that have all this potential to do good or to improve our capabilities and support decision making, regulation or legislation is about ensuring that we can trust this type of systems. All these documents and guidelines is about ensuring or providing guarantees to the general public, to the users, to the developers, to the society in general, that we can trust the systems to do what they are expected to do. Doesn't mean that the system will never have an error, but means that we know that in general we can trust the system, and if some errors or some faults happen, that we know and we have the agencies in place that can deal and take the responsibility for that. In the same way that we can trust that the eggs or the food that we buy in the supermarket has been guaranteed to be healthy or to be proper edible, in the same way that we can go to the supermarket and have a choice between eggs which are free range or organic or happy chickens or whatever other types of eggs we have there in the supermarket. If we look at eggs, we cannot really understand which type of eggs are here in this picture. But once we have these certification mechanisms, we can start trusting either both the eggs, but also build trust in the organizations that provide these certifications. And given that we cannot expect all of us in the world to become computer specialists or able to understand the code and the mechanics behind the AI systems, we do need to start looking at ways to certify or to audit and to guarantee that the AI systems that are being used are indeed trustworthy. So I would like to stop on this one. And the main message is indeed that we can do a lot with AI. We can do a lot good with AI, but we really need to start looking at the responsibility and both in processes and in stakeholders for the systems that we are using, that we are the ones who set the purpose for these systems. AI is not magic, and we really need to start taking the responsibility that comes with the benefits of using this type of systems. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have some time for questions and comments. And I think you can just feel free to grab the microphone and ask.
Yeah, sure.
So who has a question? I have several questions. Let me begin with just one. So you had one slide where you gave a list of 5 defining features of trustworthy AI.
Yes.
It began with legal, ethical, and it was something about beneficial.
Reliable, beneficial, and verifiable.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
So my question is this list meant to be prioritized so that legal is the most important because it comes first, or are they on equal terms?
I don't, there is not really a priority there, but of course, we cannot be building illegal systems. That in wherever field of development or of science or for engineering we do need to ensure that the systems that are being built and are being used are indeed aligned with whatever legal requirements are there in that area. In AI, there are not many specific legal requirements, but of course, a lot of the AI systems are embedded in other types of systems, either in robots or in decision-making systems. And there are either product-based regulation or other types of regulations which need to be ensured at any time. No one is in the business of building illegal stuff. So in a sense, the legality of the system is kind of the bottom, and there are people like Luciano Floridio who talks about the legal being the ground in which we are moving ourselves, and ethics being the sky which we would like to be on. So maybe that's a way to look at that. But I would say, yes, indeed, legal is kind of first priority, and the other ones, I don't really see there a specific priority, but they all are equally important.
Would you allow me to object a little bit to that priority?
Sure.
I mean, thinking of the legality is fundamental. Maybe that works well if you live in a just and democratic society. But I wouldn't think the same thing about the Soviet Union or North Korea, for instance. And somehow I think that ethics is more fundamental than law. And the task of democracy is to build laws that align with ethics.
Yes, that's indeed the issue. But even in a democracy, we know that not all laws aligned with ethics, and this alignment is an alignment which is temporalized. So some things which were aligned are not aligned anymore. Some things which now might be aligned were not before. So it's not something which is fixed in stone. But the issue which you give, which the example you give about legality in countries or in areas in which laws are maybe not the most appropriate ones, is not so much an issue of the law, but an issue of your own responsibility. So it's, I would put that more in the responsibility that we have for the actions and the decisions that we take as developers or users of this system. So I would say that I, as a developer of an AI system, would have my own objections of building a system that would be aligned with the North Korean laws, as an example, but that systems which are used within North Korea probably need to be aligned with the laws there, whether we like those laws or not. If they are there, one of the guarantees of a society is that the law needs to be upheld, but that doesn't mean that we from the outside don't need to be building for laws that we don't agree with. But also aligning with ethics, only aligning with ethics is also difficult because of the potential interpretation that you have there in terms of how to interpret what is right or what is not right. There you don't have, the law is one of the possible interpretations. Building and developing and living in a democratic society, I would say that we should take the law as basis to what we are doing or not. Also from a pragmatic way, because if you are building systems that you know a priori are not aligned with the law, probably you will not be able to use them.
Do we have further questions?
There was something in the chat. Let me see. Now I can look at the chat.
I think that was
someone
just...
has to leave. No, so someone leaving. Yeah,
I have a question.
Yes,
sure.
shoot.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm speaking of this legal issue. I'm curious about your thoughts on the way that the political system can kind of keep up with the development in this field. So we see a lot of regulation trying to be formed right now, some newer than others, but it seems to me that sometimes our political processes, they are bureaucratic and slow, and they have a hard time adapting to the speed of the development within AI. Could you comment on that in some way, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. So I have been working very closely with the European Union on the development of the trustworthy AI guidelines. I was a member of the group who developed those ones. So I know a little bit what the European Union is doing in terms of regulation and legislation in this area. There is other groups or other organizations in the world which are also working on that. Indeed, the law and technology are kind of working at different speeds, but they are also working at different levels of abstraction. Law tends to be much more abstract than the type of systems that we are working with. So the law shouldn't really be saying how to build these systems, but to set the boundaries to what we want. Like in terms of privacy, it's not so much about how the system exactly should be dealing with the privacy issues or with the non-discrimination issues, but the law should say that whatever the system is there, we need to ensure that privacy, and then with a formal definition, a legal definition of privacy, that needs to be satisfied. Then it's a kind of a problem for the engineer, for the developer, to interpret that definition and build the systems and guarantee, provide the auditing or the guarantees that that is indeed done. And that's a complex one. But I don't think that the law needs to be dealing with the specific characteristics of the technology all the time. And there it gives a bit of a space for both to work at different speeds.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah.
Further questions or comments?
Yeah, hi, this is Gerardo Schmider. I have a question. I think I like your presentation. It's good, of course, you have these nice acronyms that encapsulate in general what you want, like the art. But what I have not seen in your presentation is how to achieve it, because we know that accountability, for instance, is already complex in a general system, and I believe will be even more in an AI system. The same happened with transparency and
yeah.
I mean, it's already difficult to formalize legal requirement. It's already or practically impossible to formalize ethical requirements. And of course, when we want to have a system where we want to impose or to check a priori or a posteriori that the system complies with this art, I find it difficult to foresee how we can do that. I wonder if you have some thoughts or ideas on how to achieve it.
Sure. So the first part of this question is one of my first slides in which I say the AI system is not only the software. So a lot of the achievement of this type of principles needs to be done not at the level only of the software, but at the level of the processes and of the institutions involved. So the responsibility for the system needs to be taken by institutions, by people, by organizations. So it's if you build an AI system to do one thing or another, then at the same time you have to provide the guarantees that there is a process to deal with the responsibility for what the system is doing. So doesn't need necessarily to be computationalized in terms of the software of the system. So that's one part of the answer, but indeed we do try to work on building this type of guarantees or this type of principles into the software. One of the works that has been done a lot is in terms of explanation, provide systems that are able to explain or to give some background on the decisions that were taken. Another way to look at it is to provide I forgot the word, but data sets that are guaranteed to follow a certain set of principles. So there is a lot of work nowadays on looking at data sets in which you cannot really, even if it is anonymized or even if you take away the gender out of the data set, out of the variables, it is known that it's easy to reconstruct that information based on other types of data. But there is a lot of work being done now, and I've just missed the word of that type of work, but it's looking at guaranteeing that the data sets that you are using, you cannot really reconstruct information that you don't want to be identifiable in the data set. So those are kind of examples of ways to operationalize it. The issue with operationalization is that there is not a one size fits all, but depends on the type of technology, the types of methods and the techniques that you are using for developing the AI systems, which type of operationalizations work. So if you are using a deep neural network, you will need to use different types of techniques than if you are using a min-max search algorithm or something like that. But there is work being done both on the more formal verification, what we call the verifiability of the system, but also in terms of building this institutional scaffolding around the AI systems, so the social part of it.
All right. We have time for one more question. I have
By the way, if there is interest, I can share the slides if you are interested. I have no problem. Then you can send. No. Yeah. But anyway, you have one more question.
Yes. As you mentioned at one point that opening up the black box might not always be desirable. Do you have a concrete example
Yes, so there are a few times in which black box should not be open. Some of that has to do with IP. And other issues have to do with the security in terms of, I wouldn't say national security, but a lot of the work or a lot of the objections to open up black boxes have a lot to do with IP. So the intellectual property of those that build the glass box. And when the systems are not open source, there is also issues of the, let's say, the business regulations that don't allow to share the content of the black box. So we need to be able to, while we are working in methods to open up black box, we also should be working or are working on methods to be able to guarantee a certain scope of operation for a system, even if you only look at the input and output of that black box.
All right, thank you. Let's,
okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
And I'm closing the